I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
It's been just over a year since Donald Trump won the U.S. presidential election and shook the country and its political system to the core. Between the unpredictable statements and tweets, it's pretty hard to look away from the everyday chaos that dominates the news cycle. But under the surface, the turbulence Trump has brought to Washington has forced both Republicans and Democrats to question who they really are.
The best question you can ever ask about American politics is, how do parties define themselves? Do they define themselves as not the other guys? Or do they define themselves as something pure and real?
These two political parties are intellectually exhausted, and it's not clear what either of them stands for. I think most Nebraskans think that these parties are really uninspiring and unimpressive, and we need to do some fundamental reworking of things in this country.
In this episode of Fault Lines, we'll explore the way Donald Trump has impacted American politics and the fractures he's exposed in the country and its political parties. With Donald Trump in power, the Republican Party has full control of Washington, in the White House and both chambers of Congress. So the past few months since he took office should have been blissful. But they haven't been.
Does anyone need a white balance? If so, here's my shirt.
And one day on Capitol Hill encapsulated that. It should have been a good day, as Trump prepared to visit with Republican senators to discuss the one issue they can all agree on, tax cuts.
Majority Leader will go into the Majority Leader's office.
But before Trump even arrived, a brewing feud with a prominent GOP senator who had recently said he wouldn't seek re-election took over.
Look, I think the standing up in front of the American people and stating untruths that everybody knows to be untrue, just the attempted bullying that he does, which everybody sees through, just the dividing of our country. You would think he would aspire to be the President of the United States and act like a President of the United States, but, you know, that's just not going to be the case, apparently.
Trump came and went, and afterwards, Republican Senate leaders tried to project unity and downplay the president's feud with their colleagues.
If there's anything that unifies Republicans, it's tax reform. We've been looking for the opportunity to do this literally for years. We now have a president who will sign it, who believes in what we're trying to do, and we're going to concentrate on what our agenda is and not any of these other distractions that you all may be interested in.
But that appearance of calm and unity faded pretty quickly in less than an hour.
We just heard that Arizona Senator Jeff Flake is not seeking re-election. He says he feels like he doesn't have a place in the Republican Party anymore.
Why didn't you speak up? What are we going to say? Mr. President, I rise today to say enough.
Flake gave an impassioned speech to explain his decision. At its core, it was a rejection of Trump and his brand of politics.
It must also be said that I rise today with no small measure of regret. Regret because of the state of our disunion. Regret because of the disrepair and destructiveness of our politics.
Flake was facing re-election in 2018. But in the past year, as he began to speak out against Trump, he saw his approval ratings drop.
Why did you decide to do this now after everything that's happened in the presidential campaign and in the months since the inauguration?
I'm not leaving the Senate. I'm just not running again, so I'll be here for another 14 months. So there was no need to do it before. Being unencumbered by a race coming up, it is easier to speak out, although I haven't exactly done it. If I could run the kind of race I'd like to run and believe I could win a Republican primary, I might go forward. But there's a very narrow path now as a Republican. I'm a traditional Republican.
That fracture between establishment Republicans and those from the far-right branches of the party is also playing out in the state of Alabama, where there's a high-profile Senate race. In the September primary election, Republican voters here chose Roy Moore to be their nominee over an establishment candidate already serving in the U.S. Senate.
We're here for the Judge Roy Moore event. Is that here?
Let's join together in prayer.
This is a key race because losing here would endanger the Republicans' thin majority in the Senate.
We're getting ready to welcome the Republican candidate for Senate. Without further ado, let's give Judge Roy Moore a warm AFRW welcome.
You've probably already heard of Roy Moore because of a scandal that's overshadowed his campaign. In November, news broke of multiple allegations of sexual misconduct with teenage girls when he was in his 30s. Allegations he's denied. But even before that, Moore was a highly controversial candidate.
I see you got the thumbs up from the president, so I guess I'm in there. I think y'all
We came to hear him speak in late October, when he was addressing the Alabama Federation of Republican Women.
There's a big battle going on in the Republican Party. We've forgotten where we've come from and what we are about. Here are a few headlines. This is from Washington Post. Jeff Flake out, Roy Moore in. Heaven help us. Well, I hope heaven does help us.
Moore is a staunch evangelist, and throughout his career as a state judge, he stirred controversy by trying to inject religion into his courtroom.
The United States Supreme Court created out of thin air a right of marriage for two persons of the same gender.
As a judge, he refused to enforce a Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage.
They accuse me of violating the rule of law. And I'll tell you what is a violation of the rule of law. When we have a country thinking that whatever the Supreme Court comes out with in their eloquence is law.
That refusal to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling got him removed from the bench for a second time. The first time was when he installed a giant monument to the Ten Commandments in a government building, and then refused to take it down.
I want to bring God back into government.
He's also said that a congressman shouldn't be sworn in because he's Muslim. And he's rallying voters on one of the country's most divisive issues, undocumented immigrants.
The liberals holler and they'll put these people on television that worked hard. No doubt they did. No doubt they're very sympathetic toward their position. They were brought here as their children. They've grown up. It's been years now. And people want to sympathize with them. But it resulted and has resulted in a permanent evil.
He's a guy who campaigned on getting kicked off of state courts, not once, but twice, for what ethics, people kicked him off, argue, for forcing his beliefs on the state. He is so far to the right that I think he will be unique among Senate Republicans in a caucus that has moved to the right.
Are we ready for Senator Moore? And are we ready to stop illegal immigration? And are we ready for a senator from...
Moore may be on the political fringe, but in a lot of ways, he fits the model Donald Trump built. A firebrand candidate who wasn't backed by party leaders, but in a field of establishment candidates, Republican voters made him their nominee. And both Moore and Trump have raised the question of what and who the Republican Party is now.
From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land.
I don't think Republicans in Washington or Republican elites understand to this day why Trump succeeded.
This American carnage stops right here and stops right now. We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries, making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs. Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength.
What the president has revealed is that actually the Republican Party was probably always, in terms of its voters and its animating forces, much more nationalistic than a lot of us believed or thought or considered. It's not so much about free markets.
He's figured out a way to just like touch into that gut emotion that Republican voters want to hear. They want to hear a president who hates Washington with every fiber of his being and who thinks that his voters are getting lost in the new global world order.
It's time to expose the crooked media deceptions. And yes, by the way, they are trying to take away our history and our heritage.
Donald Trump is also, he's a real estate developer, right? He looks at a piece of property, figures out, well, what's going to be right in that piece of property? He looked at the Republican Party. He said, this is an incredibly right-wing party. This is a more right-wing party than its leadership understands. And so what Donald Trump has done is to make himself the vehicle for that extreme right. And anybody that thinks he's going to break that or alter that, he isn't going to. That's the base. But more importantly, he's giving them what they want.
The impulse to scapegoat and belittle threatens to turn us into a fearful, backward-looking people. In the case of the Republican Party, those things also threaten to turn us into a fearful, backward-looking minority party.
The Republicans aren't fighting a civil war on policy. I think these senators recognize, and Jeff Flake said as much, the party that they represent is changing underneath their feet as we speak. And they realize that you can't criticize Trump and all the things he stands for and all the positions he has they don't agree with and win a Republican primary.
Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
It really is an identity crisis.
It is such an honor to introduce to you Hillary Rodham Clinton.
As the Republicans try to figure out what their party's turning into, the Democratic Party is still coming to terms with its loss.
The forces at work in the 2016 election are still with us. It was a perfect storm, deep currents of anger and resentment flowing through our culture, a political process and press that told voters my emails were the most important story.
But that doesn't explain what happened during the Democratic primaries, when a self-described Democratic socialist managed to seriously challenge a politician as established as Hillary Clinton.
Look, there's been a deep division in the Democratic Party that now goes back to 1968. And it's a huge, scorching division that is very rarely discussed. There's an establishment grouping that believes Democrats can never win unless they're just marginally better than Republicans, right? It's like a kinder, gentler Republican Party. Then there's the so-called practical or compromising left. Clinton had, going into the 2016 race, the establishment, no question, and a lot of the practical or compromising left.
I certainly understand the appeal of saying, let's start all over, let's start with, single payer.
Okay, what's the idealistic left of the Democratic Party? You know what Bernie Sanders proved? It's huge. It's giant.
And what we believe is the antidote to billionaire control over our political process is when working people and young people and seniors and people of all colors and religions come together and demand a government that represents all of us, not just the 1%.
When you have somebody like Bernie Sanders come along, who in a lot of ways was the antithesis of Hillary, probably in some ways good and bad, that he resonated more authenticity. He had a much more forceful and inspiring platform, and bold and unapologetic platform, and that resonated with people.
Sanders seems to have revealed some of the inner desires residing within Democratic voters. But the problem for party leaders is how to reconcile that in the Trump era.
President Trump ought to stop tweeting and start leading. We have shown no leadership from this president, whether it's on tax reform, whether it's on health care, whether it's on North Korea. All he does is tweet and make the problem worse. Americans don't want that.
They definitely want to say they're not Trump. But do they want to say also, and we are something really different. Here's who we are. And that's what they're wrestling with. Do you just run against Trump? Or do you literally stake out a set of positions that offer you as a clear alternative, not just to Trump, but to the politics that gave you Trump? And that's a much deeper, much more fundamental thing.
They unveiled a message a couple months ago. It was called, I have to look it up because I can't even remember it. It was so not memorable. The Better Deal.
A better deal.
A better deal.
American families deserve a better deal.
Our better deal has 3 goals. More money in your pocket.
The party released an economic proposal that seemed to target people who voted for Trump, particularly white working-class voters.
There are people in our country who are getting screwed every single second, minute, and hour of the day.
The Democrats are obsessed with how do you appeal to them, speak to their issues, pull them back into the party fray.
Helping people, middle class, working class of every region of the country.
Rather than trying to excite their own base, the Democrats seem to be widening their tent. Some say at the expense of their core values.
Want us to do, and that's what our party's focused on.
Can you be a Democrat and the support of the Democratic Party if you're pro-life?
Of course.
Earlier this year, some party leaders said they would be open to supporting candidates who opposed abortion rights.
They're saying, well, some of these white working class voters may actually not like choice issues, so we shouldn't alienate them. And so for one issue raises, well, what's the point of being a Democrat?
If the Democratic Party is still searching for itself in the age of Trump, grassroots movements aligned with the party are clear about who the party should be.
We've been fighting for immigration reform. We've been fighting for reproductive rights. We've been turning out for criminal justice. And we've been voting down ballot on issues. We've got to make sure they represent our issues. And if we are at those polls and in the streets and fighting for our rights, then guess what? The Democratic Party will have to catch up to us.
We went to Detroit, where organizers of the Women's March, the large demonstrations after Trump's inauguration, gathered. People here seem to have a more crystallized view than Democratic Party leaders of how it should move forward and why it hasn't so far.
The Democratic Party is too male, too pale, and too stale.
The conversation, it's often reduced to this question of, how do we get the white working class back, as opposed to how do we build the kind of coalition that's multiracial, that's really standing up for everybody, that people are excited to be a part of.
Let me just, as a Democratic strategist, let me just tell you something. Democrats can't win in this country without black women.
Earlier this year, dozens of black women, including many of the women here, wrote an open letter to the head of the Democratic National Committee, saying the party was taking them for granted, despite the fact they're one of the party's most loyal voting blocs.
But the reality is, most of the party deals with what white men who are sitting in the room. You're right. And they decide what the message is, who the messenger is, how to deal with that message.
As women and as women of color, we've got to inject energy into the Democratic Party if we're going to win. The Democratic Party needs to restructure, and it needs to restructure from the ground up, but it needs to reflect the diversity that's in this room.
If you talk to Democrats, they'll often say, well, one thing about us is that we're a motley bunch, and that makes us a bit of a dysfunctional family. You'll hear Democrats make that criticism of themselves. The weakness of the Republican Party is that it doesn't have that diversity.
We're not going to be able to get where we say we're going.
As Democratic activists try to make leaders embrace the party's diversity, Republicans seem to have done the opposite.
What's not discussed at all is that Trump won the majority of non-working class white voters. And so this is not just a white working class problem. This is a question of what is going on with white voters, what is going on with racism in this country, and why are all those other folks actually supporting him? They're playing to the lowest common denominator within politics rather than summoning people to their highest and best selves.
This is the legacy of Hillary Clinton. Death, destruction, terrorism, and weakness.
Trump has undoubtedly appealed to a part of the Republican base by playing to, and even perhaps bringing out, fear and division, particularly when it comes to race. In that sense, The country's polarization is reflected in the way both parties have responded to America's changing demographics.
That is the Republican idea.
The Paul Ryans of the world, the Mitch McConnells of the world, the Republican elite, they understand that by doubling down on tribalism, they're forfeiting the future. But from their point of view, they're doing the rational thing. Because if they throw away the Republican base of today, in the hopes that 10 to 20 years from now, Asians and blacks and Hispanics may be more open to voting Republican again. They'll all be thrown out of office between now and then.
Way to understand the Republican Party right now is this is a party that's just experienced shock, you know, but it isn't a shock where they were taken over, per se, by something different. In reality, they were taken over by their worst self.
Mr. Moore, a word? Hello. Hi, how are you?
If the party's lifeblood is now Trump and his base, the Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore is also part of its DNA. In late October, as the election got closer, Moore visited Capitol Hill to meet his potential future colleagues and stood by his belief that a Muslim congressman should not be able to serve because of his religion. And he also reiterated his views on religion and government.
Supporters don't understand that it comes from God, comes from the Constitution.
Despite all this, he still had the support and even endorsement of senators here. The day after his visit, which was a week before allegations of sexual misconduct came out, we tried to talk to Republican senators about their support of Moore and if he represents what the party is now.
Roy Moore was on the Hill last night. What do you think about his candidacy?
Well, I support the nominee of my party over a Democrat. I disagree with a number of the statements he's made, but there's never been an absolute purity test in terms of politics supporting the nominee of the party.
Senator, can I ask you about your endorsement of Roy Moore, the Alabama Senate nominee? Are you worried about some of his extremist comments about it?
Just call our press office. I'm trying to get to a commerce hearing.
But, I mean, this is a man who's called for Keith Ellison, a member of Congress, to not serve because of his religious views. Does that concern you at all?
As I said, just call our press office.
Judge Roy Moore was on the Hill yesterday.
No comment right now.
Are you concerned that someone like him could be your colleague in the Senate on the Republican side?
Right now.
He's called Islam a false religion. He's made other pretty radical comments.
Well, he's not the first Southern senator. He's not a senator yet, but he's not the first senator to do that. And not just the Southern people have done some things like that. When you get up here, it tends to de-radicalize you. It tends to cause you to realize, hey, there are a lot of different viewpoints in this world. And we, above all people, should allow for the exchange of ideas, even those that we don't agree with. I was impressed with the man that I met yesterday, I'll put it that way.
Appreciate it, guys.
Good to see you.
When the news did break of the allegations against Roy Moore, party leaders quickly dropped their support for him.
Roy Moore should step aside. The women who've come forward are entirely credible. He's obviously not fit to be in the United States Senate.
But why did it take this for them to withdraw their support? Why did they support Moore before, despite his controversial views that were already well known? In the end, it may not matter, because the heart of the party seems to be with Moore.
I can tell you one thing for sure. We don't need a liberal person in there, a Democrat.
What you have to wonder is, would Roy Moore have been able to become the Republican nominee, and possibly a U.S. Senator, if Donald Trump had not taken over the party? Moore's fate will be determined on December 12th, when he'll face his Democratic opponent, a civil rights attorney known for prosecuting the Ku Klux Klan.
Mr. President, is an accused child molester better than a Democrat? Is an accused child molester better than a Democrat?
Look, he denies it. I mean...
It's a similar logic Republican leaders used a year ago to support Trump. The other side can't win, no matter what. Party first.
As long as Trump is there, and as long as they can see a route politically, this is what the Republican Party is going to be. It is not going to change. And you're going to see people on the periphery say, well, I'm morally offended by this. But by and large, the story is not the outliers who make the break. The story is the overwhelming majority that go right where Trump's going.
Together, we will determine the course of America and the world for many, many years to come.
This core concept that one party can win on fear, division, another can win on hope. These go to our core emotions, right? One of the great tragedies of American politics is that we often think that the anger and the fear is what's authentic.
Both parties do have an identity crisis right now. If nothing else, Trump has clarified the battle lines.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.